Good afternoon. There's always something to be said about good and evil, and since the last time I spoke about Dr. Jung's essay on good and evil, it's not actually an essay, it's an extemporaneous address that he gave, and he gave this address in, I guess he gave this address in 1959, and it was called Good and Evil in Psychotherapy. He was addressing a group of analysts, and this address was written up in the Journal of Analytical Psychology in 1960. But it's still applicable today. Dr. Jung's work is evergreen. And last year, a year ago, I did discuss this essay, or this extemporaneous address, but I didn't read it. And since that time, the following on this YouTube channel has tripled. And so we're now over 3,000 subscribers here. And I thought that since I've been doing more readings lately, I would go ahead and go back and actually read this address to you. And at the end of the address, there's a question and answer period, which I will also read. Now, this address appears in Psychology, or Civilization in Transition by C.G. Jung. This is volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And you can find below the description of this particular session, you can find links to the other discussions that we've had on good and evil. There was one Q&A session I did on this essay a year ago, and then in August there was a group session in which I discussed these issues of good and evil. So today I'm reading from Good and Evil in Analytical. Sometimes I get tongue-tied. Good and Evil in Analytical Psychology. Paragraph 858. I would like to express, before I continue, let me just mention that when I mention paragraph numbers, these are common paragraph numbers through all of Dr. Jung's collected works. And so this essay is collected in volume 10, and when it begins at paragraph 858, it's still the beginning of the essay, but this is where it appears in this particular volume. And what it means is that through all translations and all different versions of this particular essay, or all of Dr. Jung's work in the collected works, you will be able to find it in case you want to look it up in a different language, for example. So I'll start that again now. I'm reading today from Civilization in Transition by C.G. Jung. This is volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, published in the Bollingen series of Princeton University Press. Good and Evil in Analytical Psychology. Paragraph 858. I would like to express my warmest thanks to Professor Seifert for all he has said to us concerning the problem of the shadow. If I comply with your wish to add a few words, it will be about the purely empirical aspect of good and evil, which the therapist has to deal with as a concrete fact. I must confess that I always experience difficulties when discussing the problem of good and evil with philosophers or theologians. I have the impression that they are not talking about the thing itself, but only about words, about the concepts which denote or refer to it. We allow ourselves so easily to be deluded by words. We substitute words for the whole of reality. People talk to me about evil or about good and presume that I know what it is, but I don't. When someone speaks of good or evil, it is what he calls good or evil, or what he feels is good or evil. Then he speaks about it with great assurance, not knowing whether it really is so, or whether what he calls good or evil really corresponds to the facts. Perhaps the speaker's view of the world is not in keeping with the real facts at all, so that an inner, subjective picture is substituted for objectivity. Paragraph 859. If we wish to come to an understanding about so complex a question as good and evil, we must start with the following proposition. Good and evil are in themselves principles, and we must bear in mind that a principle exists long before us and extends far beyond us. Time out a moment. Sorry for that interruption. Sometimes I have to take a call from my wife. And that is a good thing. That's my hex to keep evil out of the house. If I make sure I always answer my calls to my wife, or from my wife. Anyway, okay. Paragraph 680. When we speak of good and evil, we are speaking concretely of something whose deepest qualities are in reality unknown to us. Whether it is experienced as evil and sinful depends, furthermore, on our subjective judgment, as also does the extent and gravity of the sin. Paragraph 861. You probably know the joke about the father confessor in Texas, to whom a young man comes with an awfully long face. "What's the matter?" he inquires. "Something terrible has happened." "What has happened?" "I committed murder." The confessor says, "How many?" This shows how differently two people can experience the same fact, the same reality. I call a certain fact bad, often without being sure that it really is so. Some things seem to me bad, although in reality they are not. For instance, after dismissing a patient, I have often wanted to kick myself because I thought I had done him an injustice. Perhaps I had been too brutal or did not tell him the right thing. Next time he comes, he tells me, "That was a wonderful session, just what I needed to be told." The exact opposite can also happen. I think, what an excellent session it has been, what a successful dream interpretation, and then it turns out to be all wrong. Paragraph 862. Where do we get this belief, this apparent certainty, that we know what is good and what is bad? Quote, "Ye shall be gods, knowing good and evil," unquote. Sorry, I don't have the citation for that, but only the gods know, not us. This is profoundly true in psychology. If you take the attitude, quote, "This thing may be very bad, but on the other hand, it may not," unquote, then you have a chance of doing the right thing. But if you already know in advance, you are behaving as if you were a god. But if you already know in advance, you are behaving as if you were a god. We are all only limited human beings, and we do not know in any fundamental sense what is good and bad in a given case. We know it only abstractly. To see through a concrete situation to the bottom is God's affair alone. We may perhaps form an opinion about it, but we do not know whether it is finally valid. At most, we can say cautiously, judged by such and such a standard, such and such a thing is good or evil. Something that appears evil to one nation may be regarded as good by another nation. Something that appears evil to one nation may be regarded as good to another nation. This relativity of values applies also in the realm of aesthetics. A modern work of art is, for one person, a supreme value, for which he is ready to lay out a large sum of money, whereas another person can make neither head nor tail of it. Paragraph 863. In spite of all this, we cannot simply abstain from judgment. If we call good something that seems to us bad, we have in effect told a lie. If I tell someone, what you have written is a masterpiece, thinking on the quiet that it is worth nothing, that is a lie. Maybe the lie has a positive effect on him for the moment, so that he feels flattered. But a really constructive effect is produced only when I give him the best, a positive recognition that springs from conviction, and give it, moreover, at the right moment. When we pass emphatic judgments, we are in an emotional state of mind and are then least able to apply valid criteria. Paragraph 864. My attitude to this problem is empirical, not theoretical or a prioristic. When a patient comes to the therapist, he has a conflict, and the question is then how to uncover this conflict situation, which very often is unconscious, and above all, to find a way out of the conflict. Probably the only thing I can do is to tell myself cautiously, we don't know exactly what's up. It seems to be such and such, but may not another interpretation be given with equal right. The situation may seem rather negative at first, but then one comes to see that this is just what the patient was fated to run into. So I say at most, I hope to God I'm doing the right thing. It may perhaps be an emotionally excessive situation when the patient, as Albertus Magnus says, is in an excess of effect. If we look closely, we shall see that good and evil are, as I said, principles. The word principle comes from prius, that which is first or in the beginning. The ultimate principle we can conceive of is God. Principles, when reduced to their ultimates, are simply aspects of God. Good and evil are principles of our ethical judgment, but reduced to their ontological roots, they are beginnings, aspects of God, names for God. Whenever, therefore, in an excess of effect, in an emotionally excessive situation, I come up against a paradoxical fact or happening, I am in the last resort encountering an aspect of God which I cannot judge logically and cannot concur because it is stronger than me, because, in other words, it has a numinous quality. And I am face to face with what Rudolf Otto calls the tremendum and fascinosum. I cannot conquer a numinosum. I can only open myself to it, let myself be overpowered by it, trusting in its meaning. A principle is always a supraordinate thing, mightier than I am. I cannot even conquer the ultimate principles of physics. They simply confront me, loom over me, as sheer facts, as laws that prevail. Here, there is something that we cannot conquer. Welcome, Miles and Martin. I'm doing a reading from Civilization in Transition by C.G. Jung, and I'm at paragraph 865. The essay is entitled Good and Evil in Analytical Psychology. Paragraph 865. If I say an excess of effect, this is a rotten wine, or this fellow is a dirty dog, I shall hardly be in a position to know whether these judgments are right. Another person might judge the same wine and the same man quite differently. We know only the surfaces of things, only how they appear to us, and so we must be very modest. How often have I wished to get rid, so it seemed to me, of some absolutely harmful tendency in a patient, and yet in a deeper sense, he was perfectly right to follow it. I want, for instance, to warn somebody of the deadly danger he is running into. If I am successful, I think it was a fine therapeutic achievement. Afterwards, I see, if he did not take my advice, that it was just the right thing for him to run into this danger. And this raises the question, did he not have to be in danger of death? If he had dared nothing, if he had not risked his life, perhaps he would have been poorer by a supremely important experience. He would never have risked his life and therefore would never have gained it. I just think myself of my experience of joining the Marines in 1967, and obviously I was running myself voluntarily into danger. But if I had not done that, I would have thought less of myself for the rest of my life. And so I did it, I survived, and therefore it made me a better man in my view. So I certainly concur with Dr. Jung's point here. Paragraph 866. So in the matter of good and evil, one can, as a therapist, only hope that one is getting the facts straight, though one can never be sure. As a therapist, I cannot, in any given case, deal with the problem of good and evil philosophically, but can only approach it empirically. But because I take an empirical attitude, it does not mean that I relativize good and evil as such. I see very clearly this is evil, but the paradox is that just that for this particular person, in this particular situation, at this particular stage of development, it may be good. Contrariwise, good at the wrong moment in the wrong place may be the worst thing possible. If it were not like this, everything would be so simple, too simple. If I make no a priori judgments and listen to the facts as they are, then I do not always know beforehand what is good for the patient and what is bad. So many factors are involved, but we cannot see their meaning. They appear to us veiled in the shadow, and only afterwards does light penetrate the veil. What appears in the shadow of the Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament in the light of truth. Paragraph 867. So it is in psychology. It is presumptuous to think that we can always say what is good or bad for the patient. Perhaps he knows something is really bad and does it anyway, and then gets a bad conscience. From the therapeutic, that is to say the empirical point of view, this may be very good indeed for him. Perhaps he has to experience the power of evil and suffer accordingly, because only in that way can he give up his Pharisaic attitude to other people. He's referring here to the Pharisees who condemned Christ. So I'll go back and read this last part of this sentence again. Because only in that way can he give up his Pharisaic attitude to other people. Perhaps fate, or the unconscious, or God, call it what you will, had to give him a hard knock and roll him in the dirt, because only such a drastic experience could strike home, pull him out of his infantilism, and make him more mature. How can anyone find out how much he needs to be saved if he is quite sure that there is nothing he needs saving from? He sees his own shadow, his crookedness, but he turns his eyes away, does not confront himself, does not come to terms with himself, risks nothing, and then boasts before God and his fellows of his spotless white garment, which in reality he owes only to his cowardice, his regression, his super-angelic perfectionism. And instead of being ashamed, he stands in the front row of the temple and thanks God he is not as other men. Paragraph 868. Such a person thinks he is justified because he knows what is wrong and avoids it. Consequently, it never becomes a content of his actual life, and he does not know from what he needs to be saved. Even the apocryphal saying, quote, "Man, if thou knowest what thou dost, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art accursed and a transgressor of the law," unquote, only gives us half a chance. A man who knows what he is doing when he commits evil may have a chance of being blessed, but in the meantime he is in hell. For the evil you do, even when you do it knowingly, is still evil and works accordingly. Yet if you had not taken this step, if you had not trodden this path, perhaps it would have been a psychic regression, a retrograde step in your inner development, a piece of infantile cowardice. Whoever thinks that by knowing what you do, you guard against sin or save yourself from sin is wrong. On the contrary, you have steeped yourself in sin. But this saying is so paradoxical that it is terribly shocking to our ordinary feelings. The Church, however, knows of this paradox when she speaks of the felix culpa. That's the happy fault. The Church, however, knows of this paradox when she speaks of the felix culpa of our first parents in the liturgy for Easter Eve. If they had not sinned, there would have been no felix culpa to bring after it the still greater miracle of the redemption. Nevertheless, evil remains evil. There is nothing for it but to accustom ourselves to thinking in paradoxes. Paragraph 869. Without wishing it, we human beings are placed in situations in which the great principles entangle us in something, and God leaves it to us to find a way out. Sometimes a clear path is opened with his help, but when it really comes to the point, one has the feeling of having been abandoned by every good spirit. In critical situations, the hero always mislays his weapon, and at such moments, as before death, we are confronted with the nakedness of this fact. and one does not know how one got there. 1,000 twists of fate all of a sudden land you in such a situation. This is symbolically represented by Jacob's fight with the angel at the ford. Here, a man can do nothing but stand his ground. It is a situation that challenges him to react as a whole man. Then it may turn out that he can no longer keep to the letter of the moral law. That is where his most personal ethics begin, in grim confrontation with the absolute, in striking out on a path condemned by current morality and the guardians of the law. And yet, he may feel that he has never been truer to his innermost nature and vocation, and hence never nearer to the absolute, because he alone and the omniscient have seen the actual situation, as it were, from inside, whereas the judges and condemners see it only from the outside. I'll just finish this statement, and then before reading the question and answers, I'll come back to your comments. Paragraph 870. There is a well-known story of the young man who attained his majority. His father said to him, "Now you are 20. Ordinary people stick to the Bible and what the parson says, the more intelligent mind of the penal code. In other words, you are caught between official religion and civic morality. When your own conscience collides with them, your most personal ethical decisions begin, in full consciousness of your creative freedom, either to observe the moral code or not. I may, for instance, get into a situation where, in order to keep a professional secret, I have to lie. It would be futile to shrink from this with the excuse that I am a moral man. To the devil with such self-respect." Paragraph 871. I am telling you all this in order to make my attitude in practice clear. I do not see it as my job to discuss these things philosophically. For me, there are practical matters. Of course, I am also interested in their philosophical aspect, but philosophy butters no parsnips. Okay. The reality of good and evil consists in things and situations that happen to you that are too big for you, where you are always as if facing death. Anything that comes upon me with this intensity I experience as numinous, no matter whether I call it divine or devilish or just fate. Something stronger than oneself, invisible, is at work, and one is up against it. The trouble is that we are so accustomed to thinking these problems out until everything is as clear as 2 + 2 makes 4. But in practice, it does not work like that. We do not reach a solution in principle as to how we should always act. To want one is wrong. It is the same here as with the laws of nature, which we also think of as valid everywhere. Conventional morality is exactly like classical physics. Conventional morality is exactly like classical physics, a statistical truth, a statistical wisdom. The modern physicist knows that causality is a statistical truth, but in practice he will always ask what law is valid in this particular case, so it is in the realm of morality. We should not be misled into thinking we have said something absolutely valid when we pass judgment on a particular case. This is bad. This is good. Often we have to pass judgments. We can't get out of it. Perhaps we may even say the truth, hit the mark. But to regard our judgments as absolutely valid would be nonsensical. It would mean wanting to be like God. Often even the person doing the action does not discern its inner moral quality, and the sum of all the conscious and unconscious motives underlying it, and how much less those who judge the action but see it only from the outside, only its appearance, not its deepest essence. Kant rightly requires the individual and society to advance from an ethic of action to an ethic of conviction. But to see into the ultimate depths of the conviction behind the action is possible only to God. Our judgment, therefore, as to what is good and evil in practice will have to be very cautious and modest, not so apodictic as though we could see into the all darkest corners. Ideas of morality are often as widely divergent as our views of what constitutes a delicacy for the Eskimo and for ourselves. Paragraph 872. My attitude, it may be objected, is empirical in the extreme, but we need such an attitude in order to find a solution. When we observe how people behave when they are faced with a situation that has to be evaluated ethically, we become aware of a strange double effect. Suddenly, they see both sides. They become aware not only of their moral inferiorities, but also, automatically, of their good qualities. They rightly say, I can't be as bad as all that. To confront a person with his shadow is to show him his own light. Once one has experienced a few times what it is like to stand judgingly between the opposites, one begins to understand what is meant by the self. Anyone who perceives his shadow and his light simultaneously sees himself from both sides and thus gets in the middle. Paragraph 873. That is the secret of the Eastern attitude. Observing the opposites teaches the Easterner the character of Maya. It gives reality the glint of illusion. Behind the opposites and in the opposites is true reality, which sees and comprehends the whole. The Indian calls this Atman. Reflecting on ourselves, we can say, I am he who speaks good and evil, or better, I am he through whom good and evil are spoken. The one who is in me, who voices the principles, uses me as a means of expression. He speaks through me. This corresponds to what the Indian calls Atman, that which, figuratively speaking, breathes through me. Not through me alone, but through all, for it is not only the individual Atman, but Atman Purusha, the universal Atman, the Pneuma, which breathes through all. We use the word self for this, contrasting it with the little ego. From what I have said, it will be clear that this self is not just a rather more conscious or intensified ego, as the words self-conscious, self-satisfied, etc. might lead one to suppose. What is meant by the self is not only in me, but in all beings, like the Atman, like Tao. It is psychic totality. Welcome, everyone. Early morning across the world. Paragraph 874. It is a misunderstanding to accuse me of having made out of this an immanent God or a God substitute. I am an empiricist, and as such I can demonstrate empirically the existence of a totality superordinate to consciousness. Consciousness experiences the superordinate totality in something numinous, in a tremendum or fascinosum. I'll read that sentence again. Consciousness experiences the superordinary. Consciousness experiences the superordinary. Consciousness experiences the supraordinate totality as something numinous, as a tremendum or fascinosum. As an empiricist, I am interested only in the experiential character of this totality, which in itself, ontologically considered, is indescribable. This self never at any time takes the place of God, though it may perhaps be a vessel for divine grace. Such misunderstandings arise from the assumption that I am an irreligious man who does not believe in God and just needs to be shown the way to belief. Paragraph 875. In the history of Indian philosophy, too, there have been constant attempts not to identify the Atman with the monistically conceived Brahman, the absolute ground of all being. For instance, in the Ramanuja as opposed to Shankara, or in Bhakti Yoga, and Aurobindo thinks that the Indian of today has advanced so far from the level of unconsciousness to conscious realization that this absolute can no longer have the character of a merely unconscious, impersonal cosmic force. But these are no longer questions for the pure empiricist. As an empiricist, I can at least establish that the Easterner, like the Westerner, is lifted out of the play of Maya, or the play of the opposites, through the experience of the Atman, the self, the higher totality. He knows that the world consists of darkness and light. He can master their polarity only by freeing himself from read that again. I can master their polarity only by freeing myself from them by contemplating both, and so reaching a middle position. Only there am I no longer at the mercy of the opposites. Okay, so that was the end of his discussion. I'll take a look at your comments, and then I'll go back to his Q&A period here. Let's see here. Hello, Marie. Happy New Year to you, too. Miles says, good, love versus evil, Christianity. Christianity is a principle. It sets itself up as a hierarchy, puts him among us rather than within us, a priesthood to block us, and represses a knowing love. Unfortunately, that seems to be true. Naveen says, good work, Skip, thanks, Happy New Year. Miles, colonization has forced upon us the belief that there is a separation between us and our Creator. Sherry Mitchell, indigenous, something I can't pronounce, she who brings the light. Sean says, what's weird is the tension of opposites inherent in human experience. Yes, that's true, but the tension of opposites is the source of psychic energy. That's a fundamental teaching of Dr. Jung's and of Edith Harding, who wrote the book Psychic Energy, etc. Miles says, again, I am now of the opinion Jesus Christ would be the first to tell us he did not want people to make a religion out of him, rather only his commandment to love. I don't think that Christ necessarily thought of himself as founding a religion. I think he thought of himself as a reformer in Judaism, but but he became a religion. And and Mouse says, interesting that if you spell love backward, you have evil. Yeah. Sean says, our capacity to participate in suffering voluntary, like Job, provides the most interesting mysteries. The archetype of returning to humility seems to be an important one. I think that's true. And Ma Red says, namaste, what a beautiful afternoon. Thank you for the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to continue on now. There's just a couple more pages. Let's see. 5 more pages. This is the Q&A of this speech that Dr. Jung was giving. And so the questions, I'll read the questions aside. Jung's talk appears to have ended here, then followed an unrecorded question, evidently concerning the East. Paragraph 876. We have a false picture of the East. From the East comes the humorous question, who takes longer to be saved, the man who loves God or the man who hates him? Naturally, we expect that the man who hates God takes much longer, but the Indian says if he loves God, it takes 7 years, but if he hates him, only 3. Only 3. I'll read that again. But the Indian says, if he loves God, it takes 7 years, but if he hates him, only 3. For the man who hates God thinks much more about him. What ruthless subtlety. What ruthless subtlety. But the question is absolutely right the way it is meant. It is a sort of quiz question, which may be put to the educated public, but not to a peasant. Paragraph 877. This story reminds me of something I saw in Ceylon. 2 peasants had got their carts stuck in a narrow street. One can imagine what a flood of vituperation this would have let loose here in Switzerland. But what actually happened there was this. They bowed to each other and said, passing disturbance, no soul. That is to say, the disturbance takes place only outwardly, in the realm of Maya, and not in the realm of true reality, where it neither happened nor left a mark. One might think this almost unbelievable in such simple people. One stands amazed, but this attitude is so ingrained in them that they take it for granted. Richard Wilhelm witnessed much the same thing. 2 rickshaw boys were having a fearful argument. Wilhelm thought they were going to let fly with their fists at any moment, and that blood would flow. Just then one of them rushed at the other, but rushed past him and aimed a mighty kick at the wheel of his rickshaw, and that was the end of the argument. I myself saw 2 boys quarreling and fighting with their fists, but the fists always stopped in the air, a few centimeters from the face, and no harm was done. That comes from the way these boys were brought up. It was Ceylon, where the old Buddhism still rules. It is a moral education that has become a habit, and there is nothing especially meritorious about it. Paragraph 878. Now, ladies and gentlemen, have you any further questions? A question was asked about the devil and his special reality today, since every epoch has its own peculiar devil. Paragraph 879. The devil nowadays is something quite frightful. If you look at our situation, you just cannot see where it will end. Things will go on like this as if by force. All the divine powers in creation are gradually being placed in man's hands. Through nuclear fission, something tremendous has happened. Tremendous power has been given to man. When Oppenheimer saw the first test of an atomic bomb, the words of the Bhagavad Gita flashed into his mind, brighter than 1,000 suns. The forces that hold the fabric of the world together have got into the hands of man, so that he even has the idea of making an artificial sun. God's powers have passed into our hands, our fallible human hands. The consequences are inconceivable. The powers themselves are not evil, but in the hands of man they are an appalling danger. In evil hands. Who says that the evil in the world we live in, that is right in front of us, is not real? Evil is terribly real for each and every individual. If you regard the principle of evil as a reality, you can just as well call it the devil. I personally find it hard to believe that the idea of privatio boni still holds water. Now, the idea of privatio boni is the idea that evil is simply the privation of good. So it would be suggesting something like Hitler and Stalin were evil because they didn't get enough mother's milk or something like that. And Dr. Jung was very emphatic that evil is a great power. Next question. What should the psychotherapist do? Should he give the patient a hint of how to deal with evil, or should he urge the patient to find out for himself? Paragraph 880. You are tempting me to lay down a rule, but I would rather advise, do the one thing or do the other according to circumstances, and in your therapeutic work, do not act on any a priori. But in each case, listen to what the concrete situation demands. Let that be your only a priori. For instance, a patient is still so unconscious that you simply cannot take up an attitude toward his problems. He identifies himself like a psychotic with his unconscious and would rather regard the analyst as crazy than understand his own inner situation. Try telling a completely unconscious mother, a sort of Kali Durga, who considers herself the best mother in the world, that she is to blame for the neurosis of her elder daughter and the unhappy marriage of her younger daughter. Then you will hear something. And above all, the patient is not helped. Something must grow from inside her. Another patient has reached a certain level of consciousness and expects orientation from you. It would then be a great mistake not to make your attitude clear. The right thing must be said at the right time, in the right place. Paragraph 881. The patient should not be regarded as an inferior being whom one lays on a couch while one sits behind him like a god, letting a word drop now and then. Obviously, a slam at Dr. Freud. Everything suggestive of illness should be avoided. The patient is tending in this direction anyway, and would like nothing better than to take refuge in illness. Now I can give up. Now I must just lie there. Now I am good and sick. Illness, too, is a solution of sorts, a way of disposing of life's problems. I am ill. Now the doctor must help. As a therapist, I must not be naive. Unless the patient should really be in bed, he should be treated like a normal person, indeed, like a partner. That proves a sound basis for the treatment. People often come to me expecting me to let loose some medical magic. Then they are disappointed when I treat them as a normal person and myself act like a normal man. One patient had experienced only the strong, silent God sitting behind the couch. As soon as I began to talk to her, she said, astonished, also almost horrified, "But you're expressing your effects. You're even telling me what you think." "Naturally, I have effects, and I show them. Nothing is more important than this. Every human being should be taken as a real human being and treated according to his own peculiarities. And treated according to his peculiarities. Sorry for that. Paragraph 882. Therefore, I say to the young psychotherapist, learn the best, know the best, then forget everything when you face the patient. No one has yet become a good surgeon by learning the textbooks off by heart. Yet the danger that faces us today is that the whole of reality will be replaced by words. This accounts for the terrible lack of instinct in modern man, particularly in the city dweller. He lacks all contact with the life and breath of nature. He knows a rabbit or a cow only from illustrated paper, the dictionary, or the movies, and thinks he knows what it is really like, and is then amazed when the cowsheds smell because the dictionary didn't say so. It is the same thing with the danger of making a diagnosis. One knows what this disease is treated by so-and-so in Chapter 17, and one thinks that this is the important thing, but the poor patient goes on suffering. Paragraph 883. People speak sometimes of overcoming evil, but have we the power to overcome it? It should be remembered first that good and evil are only our judgment in a given situation, or, to put it differently, that certain principles have taken possession of our judgment. Secondly, it is often impossible to speak of overcoming evil because at such times we are in a closed situation, in an aporia where whatever we choose is not good. The important thing is to be aware that we are then in a numinous situation, surrounded on all sides by God, who can then bring about either the one or the other, and often does. There are plenty of examples of this in the Old Testament. Or think of Teresa of Avila when she had a mishap on a journey. The coach broke down while crossing a small river, and she fell into the icy water. Quote, "Lord, how can you permit such things?" Unquote. Answer, well, that's how I treat my friends. Teresa responds, aha, that's why you have so few. Unquote. Teresa had got into a situation where evil, in this case physical evil, was done to her. She did not know how to integrate it, but nevertheless felt God's immediate presence. That is how the principles and primordial powers approach a person. They put him in a numinous situation where there is no rational solution, where he does not feel himself the maker and master of the situation, but rather that it is a God. No one can then foresee what will happen. Often we cannot say in such situations how the problem of good and evil will work out. We have to put our trust in the higher powers. Paragraph 884. If I am faced with this problem in analysis, I may say, quote, well, let's wait and see what the dreams turn up, or whether higher powers will intervene, perhaps through illness or death. In any case, don't decide. You and I are not God. Unquote. Paragraph 885. In making the shadow conscious, we must be very careful that the unconscious does not play yet another trick and prevent a real confrontation with the shadow. A patient may see the darkness in himself for a moment, but the next moment he tells himself that it is not so bad after all, a mere bagatelle. Or else he exaggerates his remorse because it is so nice to have such a wonderful remorseful feeling, to enjoy it like a warm eiderdown on a cold winter's morning when one should be getting up. This dishonesty, this refusal to see, ensures that there will be no confrontation with the shadow. Yet if there were a confrontation, then with increasing consciousness, the good and positive features would come to light too. We must therefore beware of the danger of wallowing in effects, remorse, melancholy, etc., because they are seductive. It is easy enough to pride oneself on being able to feel such beautiful regrets. That is why people love plays, films, or preachers that move them to tears, because they can then enjoy their own emotions. Paragraph 886. In the course of our discussion, we heard the word esoteric. It is said, for instance, that the psychology of the unconscious leads to an esoteric form of ethics, but we have to be careful in using such a word. Esotericism means mystification, yet we never know the real secrets. Even the so-called esotericists do not know them. Esotericists, at least earlier, were supposed not to reveal their secrets, but the real secrets cannot be revealed. Nor is it possible to make an esoteric science out of them, for the simple reason that they are not known. What are called esoteric secrets are mostly artificial secrets, not real ones. Man needs to have secrets, and since he has no notion of the real ones, he fakes them. But the real ones come to him out of the depths of the unconscious, and then he may reveal things which he ought really to have kept secret. Here again we see the numinous character of the reality in the background. It is not we who have secrets, it is the real secrets that have us. Okay, so that's the end of that reading, and let's just see what else you folks have said here. Okay. Red says suffering is an illusion. Well, when you're suffering it, it seems like a pretty painful one, but anyway, Buzz says, hello, I hope I have not missed too much. Well, you haven't missed much because I'm going to put it on replay. So Sean says, I don't think it is, and maybe even the opposite of an illusion. That's why they can't make AI like humans, because they do not understand human suffering. I think that's right. And Sean says, though that euphemism definitely works for some aspects. Myred says, suffering is the belief of separation. It is false. Well, I mean, there are religions, certainly in Buddhism, you're taught to evade suffering by meditation, but the problem is that you never escape it. Miles says, is that Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka? Yes. That would be an interesting place to visit. Have you been there, Skip? I have been there for about 45 minutes once in transit on an airplane going to India. But I have been, Sri Lanka is a country that is heavily populated by the Tamils, who also populate southeast India around Chennai, which is in a state called Tamil Nadu, home of the Tamils. So I do know a lot of Tamil people, although I haven't personally spent much time in Ceylon. My wife has. Miles says, suggesting that someone has a disorder as an illness is often wrong. We should recognize it as a natural disorientation to evil, such as post-traumatic stress is a natural disorientation. Yeah, I agree with that. We're certainly seeing lots of displays of that on cable news these days. Myred said, I absolutely love that Alan Watts said about Jung and how he accepted his own darkness as a part of himself. Anyone know what I'm referring to? I don't remember specifically. I've listened to some of Alan Watts's videos, but I don't remember specifically. Buzz says, sounds like Ursula Le Guin, the Wizard of Earthsea, Myred. And Myred says, I'll have to look that up. Okay, I don't know. Buzz says, you may enjoy it. There is a great audiobook of it on YouTube. Miles says, the disordered person might actually be the person not experiencing post-traumatic stress. We all should acknowledge the current traumatic stress many of us have just being present at this time of life on the earth. I think that that's quite right. We're really overwhelmed by all the things that happen to human beings in a lifetime. Keeping in mind my favorite statistic, to the extent I have one, which is that in the 16th century, the average human being was only exposed to as much information as today appears in one issue of the Sunday New York Times. So what we are exposed to today is just monumentally more than people of the medieval period. Buzz says, I think the brain is perhaps more complex, Brian. Some people have connections not working in the brain, so I have heard some may not recognize evil. Well, certainly there are psychotics who don't recognize evil. And since I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not going to opine on what may be causing that. And Myred says, suffering, yes, feels very real. Buzz says, I suffered from toothache and separation led to a lack of suffering. Yeah, well, we go through pain, and once we go through pain, we recover, and obviously that's a good thing. Okay, I've come to the end of the chats here, unless you have anything further to add. I do have some new things to talk about in the context of this good and evil, based on my own personal experiences, which perhaps in 1 to 2 more weeks I will feel free to start discussing. I have been engaged in a lawsuit for 7 years, and I've been serving as my own counsel during all of that time. And the evil that's represented in my lawsuit goes to every county clerk's office in the United States, certainly, and possibly in the world. And so I intend to start talking about that. Yesterday, I formally lost my lawsuit. And and so that's both a good thing and a bad thing. But it's but I did do an I Ching reading, an I Ching reading before, and so the question I asked the oracle in the I Ching was, what should we expect of Friday's hearing? And the reading I got was hexagram 58, encouraging joy, and the change was 42, benefit increase. And so I feel that that's a very appropriate hexagram, and it just makes me giggle because it means that the future is bright indeed. But I'll go on with that in more detail later on. I'm not going to go into much more detail today. But anyway, it's certainly kept me busy for a long time, and it's been very much like a full-time job. And so if you imagine how monumental the investigation that Robert Mueller is going through with his team, mine was every bit as monumental, and I had to do it solo. And the consequences are every bit as big. But by the way, I've pretty much known that I was going to lose since about July of 2015. But because I realized what was happening and had happened, and I realized that very few people have been conscious of what has happened, I decided to proceed with the case. I took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court once. I took it to the Maryland Court of Appeals 5 times. And but my objective, going back to at least July of 2015, if not before, has been to get it all on the record. So it's now on the record what has been done to us, how they're doing it to us, and how they're manipulating us. And it goes to Henry Ford's quote, which may be a quote also from someone in the 19th century. But anyway, the quote was, if the average person knew how the financial system of the country worked, there would be a revolution. And while I'm not expecting a revolution, I do hope that there will be more consciousness. So anyway, and Buzz says, the I Ching says something like, even if he stands alone, he will not fear. And as my wife and I were going into our hearing yesterday, and she was aware of the reading I had done, I said, of course, this doesn't mean whether we will win or lose. And I have to say that in the hearing, that we would win or lose. And I have to say that I feel vindicated by the reading, and I'm looking forward to the future. Because now, when one is in a lawsuit, it's somewhat unethical to try the lawsuit in the public square and newspapers and things like that. And of course, we do see that with famous personages, and we see it every day on our cable news. but I have respected the um, privilege of the court to keep these things out of the newspaper, so I have not done anything about it up until now. But now the story can be told, and it's going to be a wild ride. That I can promise. And let's see. It says, I think Dostoevsky said, if there was a revolution, the same people would end up back in power. And he's quite right about that. You're quite right. And after this consciousness, the same people will end up back in power. However, they may be somewhat transformed, let's say, in how they approach the rest of us. Miles says, I once hired a lawyer who said I would win in his belief. He said monetarily I would not gain, so I dropped it all. Regret that it did not continue in principle. Well, what I would say is that the average person could not do what I have done. I've put more than, at this point, about $1.5 million worth of legal time into defending myself. And so, and it's a civil matter, so it's not a question of a crime, but no one else would do that. And the only reason I did it was, or one of the reasons, but a big reason why I did it was because I wanted to know just how bad things were, and I wanted to get it on the record so that then others can do what they need to do about it. And you know, in effect, it is a win for us in one way, but I'll discuss it in more detail when I have gathered my thoughts. Martin says, maybe there is only consciousness. I think that if we believe in duality, if we believe that there is duality, then we have to believe that there's an unconscious also. Sean says, when everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. Yes, I agree. And Sean says, that's my favorite Henry Ford quote. And Ma says, what we resist, we persist. Absolutely. I've experienced that in spades. Buzz, no lawyers lost any money in the carrying out of this case. No lawyers lost any money in the carrying out of this case. Also, no bankers, and also not us. And so not only no lawyers lost any money, but no one lost any money in this case. Xbox J Pro 3 says, just arrived, are you talking about challenging our government's practices or something that directly happened to me? I am talking about something that has happened to at least 10 million families in the last 10 years in the United States, and it's not directly related to government practice per se, but government practice was and is involved. And Miles says, yeah, it's $630 an hour. It's hard to fight a corporation. Yeah, fortunately, I had the education to do that. Myred says, much like the shadow, we need to embrace going through the shadow. Yes. And Andrew says, did Dr. Jung believe ultimately that all is psyche, or did he believe in a kind of duality, both a psyche and an external material reality? Well, I think that Dr. Jung believed that the physis and the psyche are two sides of the same coin in duality. And you see that clearly if you haven't read Answer to Job, I highly recommend it. But you see that clearly in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job. And so I'll just read the quote to you, since I often have it within arm's reach. He's talking about the assumption of the Virgin Mary as referred to by a papal bull that was issued by Pope Pius XII in 1950. And what he says is, this is paragraph 752, clearly the material evidence for the existence of this psychic phenomenon is more than sufficient. It does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche, and not with the reality of the faces. So, and then up above that in paragraph 751, Dr. Jung said, people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche is real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically but not physically. So those are sort of the punchline comments on religion from my lights. So I hope that answers your question, Andrew. And Buzz says, good for you then, as I read the I Ching says, a cautious hit halfway brings about supreme success. Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, thank you for joining me today. I have to join my wife for lunch, so I'm going to sign off for today, and thank you for joining me. It's always a very popular topic to talk about good and evil. I'll see you again soon.